Hi everyone. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about life as a conductor in quarantine. Certainly, there are a lot of people out there who are having a more difficult go of it than I am, for sure. But it is a strange kind of situation for conductors. What we do, of course, is inherently collaborative, and so we don't do what we do without other musicians in the room. So when we have no other musicians in the room, what do we do with ourselves is an important question. And one option we have, an option that any musician has, is that we can practice. And yes, conductors actually do practice. We don't like to admit that very much because there's still this kind of myth about conductors being born and not made, and so if we admit that we practice, then that suggests that we weren't kind of fully formed coming out of the womb. And if we weren't fully formed coming out of the womb, then that means that we might be, fallible or something like that. And the things that we do, which are objectively stupid, we can't just say, well, I was inspired or something like that. So, but yes, secretly we do practice. What do we practice as conductors? Well, we can practice baton technique. That one's tricky, certainly for me. When the way I evaluate whether my stick waving is working or not is by the response of the orchestra. If the musicians sound the way I expect them to sound, then I keep doing what I'm doing, and if not, then I change it. So conducting without an orchestra takes away that really important feedback. It's sort of like if you're playing an instrument, any instrument, and you put on like noise canceling headphones as you play, there's still some value to that. You can get some kind of tactile feedback, and you can do a lot of visualization or something like that. But you don't get that immediate feedback from the instrument, which is so important when you're practicing. So what can I practice? Well, I can practice my score study, and I don't actually have a lot of my scores with me, unfortunately. I am quarantined in one country, and all my scores are in a different one. But I can still practice that process. I think I get asked a lot, I'm sure most conductors do, by people. They look at our big scores with the 20 instruments listed and all those millions of notes, and they say, wow, how do you keep track of all that different stuff in your head? And it feels very good for your ego. But the correct answer to that, honestly, is that we don't keep track of a million separate things all at once. That would be impossible. The goal, instead, is to take all of those million things and turn them into a unity. If you want to think of it like baking a cake or something like that, where I don't want to taste the eggs and the flour and the milk and the sugar and all of that separately. I want to taste the cake. If something goes wrong with the cake, I want to be able to know that, yes, there are too many eggs or not enough sugar or something like that. But when I'm actually eating the cake, I want, the whole idea of the cake. And it's the same thing at any given moment in the music. I want to be hearing all those millions of things as a unified event, rather than a bunch of separate things. And so score study you can describe as kind of that process. How do we take all of this visual information and turn it into this kind of image of a single work? And it is a skill. It's something that you can practice and get better at. And so as conductors, we have ways of doing that. If you've taken more than about 2 conducting lessons in your life, you've probably had a teacher tell you, you need to get the Boyd Riemenschneider book of Bach Chorales in open score. And I have my Boyd Riemenschneider book of Bach Chorales in open score. There's 91 of them in here, even though I don't have any of my actual scores. But here, I'll show you what this looks like. So here we go. This is chorale number 1 from Cantata number 153 there. And you'll see what it looks like there. Open score means that we have 4 staves. Instead of having like 2 that you would see for piano music, we get 4 parts for each of the 4 voices: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So yeah, this first page is chorale number 1. And if you read music, you see these clefs over here. You probably recognize bass clef at the bottom. You may or may not recognize those other three. Those are all C clefs, which means that little kind of divot in the middle is refers to middle C on the piano. And you can move that up and down. So the top one, if you put the C on the bottom line, is soprano clef. Your middle one there is alto clef, and your third one down is tenor clef. And it's really important for conductors to be able to read all of those. Tenor clef is an alternate clef for bassoon and trombone and cello when they get into their upper register. Alto clef is the standard clef for viola. It also gets used by trombones a fair amount. Soprano clef is rare. It's more or less been replaced by treble clef, but it's you still see it as used up into the middle of the 19th century, so you still see it in old editions of music. I still conduct from music that uses soprano clef, especially choral music. And it's also really helpful for transposing instruments that look at one note and play a different one, but that's a can of worms that we won't get into. So, as I say, the goal then for these is to take these four separate staves and kind of make them into one, to be able to play them all at once, to hear all four parts at once. And you can think of it as sort of a conducting etude, much in the same way that violinists play Kreutzer and Schroeder Concepcic and things like that, and brass players all play out of the Arbin book. These are kind of simplified scores that help us with that process of taking our larger scores and making them into unified wholes. I don't want to turn this into a big lecture on Bach, but before we dive into how we actually learn these, I should mention a little bit about where they come from. Bach, of course, the great seminal German composer of the Baroque. This is early 1700s in his case, and he was the music director for a church in Leipzig, the St. Thomas Church. And they had, for every feast day and for every Sunday of the church year, he wrote a new cantata. Cantata being really, it just literally means a piece that you sing. And so he had to churn these out week after week after week after week for each of these different kinds of services that they had. So in the Lutheran liturgical calendar, they're basically, you have all your feast days, of course, and the big ones being Christmas and Easter, and the rest of the Sundays are kind of fit in among those. And each Sunday has its own set of readings that goes along with it. So for cantata number 153, which is where this first chorale is used, that was intended for the second Sunday after Christmas, which is sort of a weird one in that it doesn't actually always happen. So Epiphany, when the wise men show up, 12th day of Christmas, actually starts a new set of weeks. And sometimes you get 2 Sundays in between Christmas and Epiphany, and sometimes you only get 1. So this second week after Christmas, but before Epiphany, doesn't always happen. And in fact, in 1725 and 26, it did not happen. But in 1724, it did. So Bach needed a chorale for the second Sunday of Christmas that year. The texts for these, like the scriptural readings, are always the same, and the kind of theme of the text for that week is sort of faith in the face of adversity or something like that. So when Bach was choosing his chorales and his chorale texts, he would have wanted to have music and text that fit that theme. So Bach rarely actually wrote any of the chorales. The chorale tunes were sort of familiar hymns that already existed, and the words would have been written by other people. So he'd use, what he did write was the harmonies that went along with them. But yeah, this melody that he used for Cantata 153 goes back to the time of Martin Luther, and the text was written by a guy named David Deneke, who was a sort of a law practicing judge type, but he also wrote a lot of religious texts, and that was decades before this actual cantata was written. But the text that he used and the music, again, supports this kind of idea of making it through tough times. And so the music, the chorale tune has this kind of somber, dark feeling to it. It's got some pain in it. And the text, sort of rough translation here would be, look, dear God, how my enemies, with which I always have to fight, they're so cunning and mighty that they can easily sort of bring me down, discourage me. Lord, if I didn't have your grace, then the devil, the flesh, and the world would very easily be able to sort of plunge me into misfortune or calamity or something like that. So anyway, that's the mood that we're working with this chorale. And so the next question is, how do we learn it? So as I say, the goal is to eventually just be able to play all 4 parts all at once. But we don't just want to dive in with just the piano. As I say, a big value to this is the clef learning, the clef reading. And if I just play it on the piano, I don't actually have to read the clefs. I can just follow the line up and down. I just need to know what the first note is, and then I can play it without actually caring what the notes are. I don't want to do that. I want to force myself to actually recognize the notes as I'm playing them. And the way you can do that is to sing it on fixed do solfege. So solfege is the thing you learned in The Sound of Music: do, a deer, a female deer, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. And it's basically you just put syllables on each of the notes of the scale. When you do fixed do solfege, you're actually, it doesn't matter what key you're in or anything, just C is always do, doesn't matter what key you're in, doesn't matter which kind of C it is, always do all the time. Fa is always F, La is always A, and that way you're actually naming the notes as you're singing them. So the first thing I would do with this is actually play and sing, say the soprano line, the chorale tune. Si, do, si, la, mi, re, do, si, la, si, do, re, do, si, la. That actually repeats, but I'll go on for now. La, si, la, so, fa, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, si, la, sol, la. La, mi, do, re, do, si. Yeah, sorry for the purists in the audience, I am singing it down an octave, but I'm okay with that. And then I go on to the other parts, so the alto part. Sol, la, si, mi, fa, sol, la, so, fa, mi, etc. Now again, I don't want to be learning these just as individual lines. I want to be combining them and hearing them together. So you start playing and singing different lines. So I can play the alto and sing the soprano. Si, do, si, la, mi, re, do, si, la, si, do, re, do, si, la, etc., etc. Then I can switch. Sol, la, si, mi, fa, sol, la, so, fa, mi, etc. And you can do these in any combination with any number of parts. There's actually a total of about 50 different ways you can combine singing and playing for each of these. So next, for instance, I could do playing soprano and bass while singing tenor. Mi, mi, re, do, si, do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do, sol, la, so, do, etc., etc., like that. So again, the end goal here is to play all 4 parts at once. And what I like to do actually to finish things up is to actually sing the chorale along with it as I play. Schau, lieber Gott, wie meine Feind, damit ich schätzlos kämpfen soll listig und so mächtig sein, dass sie mich leichtlich dämpfen. Herr, wo mich deine Gnad nicht hält, so kann der Teufel Fleisch und Welt mich leicht in Unglück stürzen. Yeah, sorry, a little bit of grit in my voice there, but certainly I think you can hear the, again, the pathos that comes through in this chorale. And I think it's nice to actually put the words with it at the end to remind yourself that, you know, it's real music. But in any case, that's number 1, only 90 to go. Maybe we'll make it into a series. But I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you're doing well, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.